It's June 24, 1982, and the unthinkable has happened on board at British Airways Boeing 747. All four engines have suddenly failed miles above the Indian Ocean without power. The massive plane is now descending. The pilots have mere minutes to restart the engines before they and their 261 passengers and crew meet their demise in the ocean below. What follows is an incredible tale of grit, teamwork, and above all, coolness under pressure. And I've invited the captain himself to tell the story. This is the story of British Airways Flight 9. Before proceeding, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you. On the evening of June 24, 1982. 3 pilots and 12 flight attendants boarded a British Airways Boeing 747 at Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Waiting for them on board were 248 passengers, most of whom had gone on the aircraft at London's Heathrow Airport almost a day earlier. The journey was a long one for the passengers. After leaving London the previous day, Flight 9 had stopped over at Bombay in India before arriving at Kuala Lumpur from here. The flight will continue on to Perth before flying to Melbourne, from where it would embark on the final leg of its journey to New Zealand. While many of the passengers were already tired from the long flight, the crew who had flown into Kuala Lumpur a few days previously were fresh, and they would need to be as they stepped on board their gigantic aircraft and headed up to the cockpit. They had no idea that they were about to face the greatest challenge of their entire careers. The fate of everyone on board would depend on their skill and perseverance as they fought against an invisible foe miles above the dark ocean. But at least for now, all was normal. In command of the flight was Captain Eric Moody at 41 years old. He was one of British Airways' youngest 747 captains. He had thousands of hours of flying experience under his belt, which he'd accumulated in a wide variety of aircraft. And as Luke would have it, he had started his career as a glider pilot, something which, much to his surprise, would end up being very useful on this night. Joining him in the cockpit were 32-year-old First Officer Roger Greaves and 40-year-old Fight Engineer Barry Townley Freeman. The Fight Engineer in particular was highly experienced and knew the aircraft systems inside out. In fact, he was a training flight engineer who taught new flight engineers how to manage the aircraft systems. In other words, the passengers could not have been in safer hands at 7:45. That evening, the huge jet pushed back from the gate at Kuala Lumpur. The passengers settled in for the 5-hour journey to Perth. As it happened, the flight was 30 minutes behind schedule because it had been late arriving in from Bombay on a journey from the UK to New Zealand. A 30-minute delay normally wouldn't mean much to the passengers, but on this night it would end up being fateful. Captain Moody taxied the aircraft out to the runway at Kuala Lumpur. He would be flying the plane on this leg of the journey. The skies were clear and the winds were light. It was perfect weather for flying. But unbeknownst to the crew, right at that moment trouble was brewing deep inside the Earth's crust, 1,300 kilometers to the southeast of Kuala Lumpur. The Galangun volcano on the island of Java had started to erupt. It had begun to eject huge quantities of ash and dust high into the atmosphere and directly into the planned route of Flight 9. At 8 o'clock that night, Captain Moody powered up his aircraft for Rolls-Royce engines for takeoff, and the massive jet thundered down the runway. Within moments, the plane was airborne and turned southeast towards Perth. For the first 2 hours or so, everything went to plan. The captain climbed the aircraft to an altitude of 37,000 feet, where it would stay for most of its trip to Australia. The 248 passengers were served dinner, and many tried to get some sleep in order to adjust to the new time zone at their destination. The pilots were served dinner as well, which included a tray of satay, a Malaysian specialty. As the plane cruised along smoothly at 37,000 feet, the pilots carried out the standard en route checks. They compared their fuel against the amounts listed on the flight plan. They checked that the autopilot was keeping the plane on course, and they made routine radio calls to air traffic control. At one point, Captain Moody galloped to use the bathroom. He checked the weather radar before heading out just to make sure there was no weather ahead. And indeed, the night sky ahead appeared perfectly clear. But within seconds of him leaving, a strange phenomenon lit up the cockpit. The cockpit windshears were illuminated by what's known as St. Elmo's fire, a phenomenon which occurs when electrically charged particles discharge on the windscreen and other front-facing parts of the aircraft, creating what looked like small lightning strikes. It's a completely harmless phenomenon, and this was far from the first time that the first officer or flight engineer had seen it. But there was something strange about this particular display. Normally it's only experienced when the plane is flying through or near thunderstorms. But the pilots of Flight 9 could not see anything on their weather radar. What could be causing this display? As a precaution, the crew turned on the fasten seatbelt signs and put the engine's start switches to continuous ignition. This latter step would ensure that the engines would stay lit even if they ingested significant amounts of rain or ice. But as the seconds ticked by, the phenomenon kept getting stronger. Before long, it was the most intense St. Thomas fire the crew had ever seen, awed by the sheer brilliance of the display. First Officer Greaves and Flight Engineer Townley Freeman asked for a flight attendant to get the captain. At that moment, Captain Moody was downstairs chatting to one of the flight attendants. As he made his way back upstairs, he noticed something odd. Here's how he described it in a conversation I had with him for this episode. Went up the stairs with the circular staircase at the back, and as I got my eyes to the level with the floor, I could see this smoke billowing in from around what I call the skirting. It's where the air conditioning air came in, and even more concerningly, it had an unusual smell, and I could smell this accurate electrical burning smell, which at the time was typical of the London tube. The captain was now on high alert. Were electrical wires smoldering in the electronics bay beneath the cockpit. An onboard fire is one of the worst things that can happen in aircraft, and they've been responsible for hundreds of passenger fatalities over the years. If there was a fire on board, Moody would have less than 20 minutes to get the plane to an airport. I went on the flight deck expecting them to say that we had smoke or fire in the electronics downstairs, and could they fire the fire extinguisher. But when he came back into the cockpit, what he encountered was not two worried colleagues rushing through fire drills, but rather the most stunning display of St. Elmo's fire he had ever seen. The three men were transfixed by the sight in front of them, as lightning bolts of all shapes, sizes, and colors flashed up and down their windscreens. The captain got into his seat, strapped himself in, and checked his weather radar. In his experience, St. Elmo's fire only occurred when there were thunderstorms, or a high thin layer of cloud known as cirrus, but after tilting the radar dish up and down, scanning for storms, he could see nothing. This was truly baffling. It appeared as if he had encountered St. Delmas fire in clear air. He turned his head back out to his side window to look at the engines, and shockingly, the same phenomenon appeared to have taken hold of them. They were glowing blue as if lit from within, and not only that, but the leading edge of the wing, too, was lit up like a white-hot knife. First Officer Greaves looked back out his window and saw exactly the same thing on his side. But the show wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only just getting started. Within seconds, the St. Emma's fire on the windscreen had been replaced by an even more dazzling display. It appeared as if thousands of miniature blue tracer bullets were being fired at the windscreen. It was as if the plane was entering warp speed, about to go headlong into another dimension. The pilots were stunned. What on earth could be happening? There was nothing else to indicate that anything was out of the ordinary. There was no shaking or vibration and no strange noises. The whole event was entirely peaceful until at 8:20 that night. Engine number 4. The outboard engine on the right-hand side suddenly failed. Captain Moody immediately called for the engine shutdown checklist, and the fight crew began shutting down the engine. This involved moving the thrust lever to idle, switching the start lever to cut off, which removed the fuel supply, and arming the fire handle in case of an engine fire. An engine failure wasn't exactly a common occurrence, but on a 4-engine plane like the 747 it was far from alarming. The aircraft was perfectly capable of flying on 3 engines, but the pilots had barely reached the end of the checklist when, without warning, engines 2 and 3 failed as well, followed immediately after by Engine 1. The pilots couldn't believe it all. 4 engines had failed. Their massive jet carrying 263 passengers and crew had now become the world's largest glider, and now with every passing minute it was getting closer and closer to the ocean below. Within a few short seconds, their unusual situation had gone from awe-inspiring to life and death. The fate of everyone on board now depended on whether the pilots could somehow salvage their crippled aircraft before it plunged into the Indian Ocean below. We didn't believe it was happening. We just could not believe that all four engines were failing. We went through, I'm sorry, a whole period of disbelief. It's almost unprecedented for all engines to fail simultaneously on a passenger jet for that to happen. It's almost always because the pilots had done something wrong with this in mind. The captain checked the fuel pumps. Had he and his crew accidentally set the engines to draw fuel from only one tank, which then ran dry? But sure enough, when he checked, the fuel pumps were drawing from every tank well. What about the electrical system? Moody checked the circuit breakers but found no issues there either. Or was it icing at their altitude? It wasn't. Unthinkable that ice had clogged the engines. He turned on the engine anti-system, but it didn't seem to be that either the three crew members were convinced that they had messed up. But they had to force this conviction to the back of their minds now. In a life-and-death fall towards the Indian Ocean, they had one task and one task only: to restart the aircraft's engines. If they couldn't do this, they would come crashing down into the water below. In a matter of minutes, the captain told the first officer to declare a mayday to air traffic control, while he and the flight engineer went through the checklist to restart the engines. As they did this, the captain began turning the plane back towards Jakarta. At their high altitude, there was a danger that the loss of thrust from the engines would slow the plane to the point where it would stall and fall out of the sky. To avoid this, the captain pitched the aircraft's nose down to maintain speed. Those are delicate balance to be struck here in physics terms. The captain had to trade potential energy in the form of the aircraft's height for kinetic energy in the form of its speed. But the most precise flying in the world wouldn't prevent the inevitable if the other pilots couldn't get the engines restarted without engines. For every 15 kilometers the plane moved forward, it would lose 1 kilometer in altitude from an altitude of 37,000 feet. This meant the pilots could travel about 165 kilometers on the bright side. That was just enough to glide to the nearest airport, which was Jakarta, or it would have been were it not for one important thing. Between the aircraft and Jakarta was a massive wall of mountains 3.5 kilometers high. There was no way the plane would be able to make it over the mountains from its current position. This meant that if the pilots couldn't get the engine started, they would have to do the unthinkable. They would have to turn around and ditch their fully loaded 747 on the ocean. At night, they knew well that this meant almost certain death for everyone on board. The pressure they were under was tremendous, and though they didn't know it yet, the worst was still ahead of them. For some reason, the first officer was unable to get his message through to air traffic control over the radio. He tried again and again, but the controller seemed completely unable to understand him. The controller seemed to think that the number 4 engine had failed the rightmost engine, when what the first officer was telling him was that all 4 engines had failed for one thing. There was an element of sheer disbelief on the part of the controller. All 4 engines don't just fail on a modern passenger jet. But it wasn't just that, unbeknownst to the crew or anybody else. Flight 9 had flown directly into an ash cloud thrown up by the Mount Galungun volcano on the island of Java. The light show the pilots were seeing on their windshields was a result of static electricity discharging from the dry ash. As the plane flew through it at almost 1,000 kilometers per hour incredibly, this had created a kind of electronic cocoon around the aircraft, garbling any radio signals being sent or received by the pilots. This made it extremely difficult for the controller to make out what the pilots were saying. But miraculously, a few dozen miles behind Flight 9 was a Singapore Airlines Boeing 747 on the same route. The pilots of that flight could hear the first officer more clearly, and they relayed his messages to Jakarta Air Traffic Control. Finally, the gravity of the crew's situation was understood by those on the ground not wanting to get caught up in the same situation. The pilots of the Singapore Airlines flight turned around in the cockpit of British Airways Flight 9. The pilots were on their own, as if their situation wasn't already strange enough. What was happening to their plane did not match up with what they had practiced in the simulator. For one thing, the lights were on in the cockpit, despite the near-total loss of electrical power. In addition to this, some systems were working, which were not supposed to be working. While others which were supposed to be working weren't. We were like a bar magnet going through the ether. We were making our own electronic field around us. Our back magnet field, in fact, that accounted for it, holding in, I think, some relays that should have collapsed and otherwise vice versa. So I think that we had electronics not working that should have been working because the relays had collapsed. Vice versa, we had certain things that were working that shouldn't have been working because relays were held in strangely. One of the systems which was working was the autopilot. This was a tremendous help to the pilots, with the autopilot engaged. The captain was freed to help his colleagues with the engine relights in the passenger cabin. The passengers were terrified the comforting hum of the engines had been replaced by an eerie silence as the plane descended towards the ocean below. Wisps of accurate electrical smoke began pouring into the cabin, stinging the eyes of the passengers and causing some to cough upstairs. The passengers in the first-class cabin just behind the pilots were mostly asleep. But in the cockpit, this smoke, which under normal circumstances would itself be caused for extreme concern, was not even on the pilots' minds. They had a far more immediate danger to contend with. Despite their numerous attempts, the engines were still not restarting. Second by second, the altimeter was unwinding, much like a clock when it reached zero time was up. The pilots couldn't add any time to this clock, but they could cram in as many engine restart attempts as they could in the time they had left. However, the checklist for restarting the engines was long and convoluted. If they followed each step, they would only get a few attempts to restart the engines before hitting the water. If we'd followed the book, we'd be dead on one occasion. I said, "Forget the book." The pilots shortened the checklist to only the most essential items and went through it again and again and again as the altimeter counted down to zero. The adrenaline in the small space of the cockpit was through the roof. But then, in the midst of their dogged attempts, came an unwelcome warning. The plane was beginning to depressurize without engines to feed air into the cabin. The air was beginning to leak out at their current altitude of 26,000 feet. There wasn't enough oxygen to sustain life quickly. The pilots went to grab their oxygen masks, but when First Officer Greaves went to put his on, it fell apart in his hands. The other two crew members had managed to put theirs on and were able to talk to each other through the inbuilt microphones. But the first officer vital to the crew's engine restart efforts was now out of the loop. And what's more, without enough oxygen in the thinning atmosphere, he would soon lose consciousness. Captain Moody had an incredibly tough decision to make. Should he put his aircraft in a dive to a lower altitude in order to save his colleague, or should he keep his precious altitude so that he would have more attempts at restarting the engines? The captain and flight engineer discussed their options and came to a decision. I got a recollection that my engineer agreed that we got down to 20,000 feet. We could all take our oxygen mask off, and then we were back as a crew. So it was decided the captain was going to make a risky bargain. It was either stupid or brave, one or the other. He was going to trade precious altitude for the use of his first officer. He pulled the speed brake handle and pushed the nose of the aircraft down. The passengers' stomachs went up into their mouths as the plane entered its dive. The whole aircraft rumbled and shook as the speed brakes disrupted the smooth flow of air over the wings. This was a dramatic maneuver and was all being done so that the first officer could be brought back into the team in the cockpit. The checklist for this rapid descent called for the pilots to extend the landing gear. But again, Moody decided to do away with the checklist. He knew that if he were to put the aircraft down to the ocean, extended landing gear would cause the plane to dig into the water, tearing it apart. Within just 1 minute, the plane had lost a whopping 6,000 feet now. At 20,000 feet, Captain Moody stole the speed brakes and reduced the plane's rate of descent incredibly during the dive under immense pressure and looming hypoxia. The first officer had managed to reassemble his oxygen mask. The three men were now back as a team, but now at their much lower altitude of 20,000 feet, their efforts to restart the engines took on a new level of urgency. But as if this wasn't bad enough, the captain now noticed a new complication. His airspeed indicator said that the plane was flying at 270 knots, while the first officer said that it was flying at 320 knots. This difference was vitally important. In order for the engines to restart, the plane needed to be flying up between 250 knots and 270 knots outside of this narrow window, and it just wouldn't happen. So again, the captain was faced with a tough decision. Which instrument should he believe? If he made the wrong call, the engines might not restart. Horrifying sight. Bright tendrils of flame began shooting back from the engines. The inside of the cabin was being lit up red and orange as hot flames rushed by outside. It was like something out of a nightmare. Not only was the plane hurting towards the ocean as the cabin filled with smoke, but now its engines were on fire. Some passengers screamed. Others began writing notes to loved ones, hoping that they would be discovered after the plane had crashed. Pilots weren't aware of this fire, but if they had been, it wouldn't have bothered them all that much. Part of the procedure for restarting the engines required, naturally enough, that fuel be fed into them and ignited. Under normal circumstances, this ignition would take place inside the engine. But with the engines failed, all of this fuel was streaking back from them and being ignited outside the engine, causing the massive jets of flame. At this point, the captain decided to address the passengers to try to put them at ease. His words would go down as one of the best examples of understatement in the history of aviation, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. All 4 engines have stopped. We are doing our damn just to get them going again. I trust you're not in too much distress at the end of this message. He also asked the chief flight attendant to come to the cockpit in British Airways. This was code for the flight attendants to prepare the cabin for a crash landing or a ditching in the water. The head flight attendant rushed up to the cockpit, and Captain Moody briefed him on preparing the cabin for a ditching in the ocean, but the flight attendant was unable to understand Moody through his oxygen mask. He figured that rather than asking him to repeat himself in what was clearly an inopportune moment, he would be best to leave the pilots to it and get back to preparing the cabin. The pilots have tried restarting the engines well over a dozen times now, and still there were no signs of life. They had to make a tough decision. Looming in the darkness ahead of them was a towering mountain range on the other side of it. Play the airport without engines, they wouldn't be able to clear the mountains. So Captain Moody gave the crew an ultimatum. If they weren't able to get the engines restarted, by the time the plane had reached 12,000 feet, they would turn around and ditch the plane in the ocean at night with no way to see the ocean coming up to meet them. It would be nearly impossible for the pilots to make a ditching survivable. Below them truly lay the abyss, but even given how hopeless the situation looked, the pilots pushed on relentless in their efforts to restart the engines. We were all bloody-minded people. My granny brought me up to believe that in the English language there's no such word as can't, you're a can-do boy. So I wasn't going to give up. The other 2 were from the North Country, and they don't give up in anything. And the engineer was a training engineer, and the first officer was a very, very competent North Country lad. Even though the checklist disallowed it, the captain decided to try to restart engine number 4 as well. When they had first shot it down, they had armed the fire handle in case there was an engine fire. After doing this, it is not allowed to try to restart the engine, but in their situation, no procedure took precedence over restarting the engines after all. If they were only going to get one of their engines restarted, there was a 25% chance that it would be engine number 4. The plane was now approaching 12,000 feet, the altitude at which the pilots had decided they would turn around and ditch by if they hadn't got the engines restarted. Then all of a sudden, after countless attempts, engine number 4 roared back to life. The pilots were overjoyed. Captain Moody pushed the engine to maximum thrust, enabling him to stretch the plane's glide that much further. But one engine would not be enough for them to clear the mountain range. The pilots needed at least one more. The seconds ticked on. As the crew, buoyed by their success, with engine number 4 continued their efforts on the other 3 engines. 30 heart-pounding seconds later, engine 3 came back online. Now the crew were in with a real chance. About a minute after that, The other two engines washed back to life, pushing the pilots into their seats as they powered up the crew, were now, in the words of the first officer, back in business. The first officer radioed air traffic control telling them that they had managed to restart all four engines, and the captain informed the passengers just minutes away from impacting the ocean. Disaster had been averted, but their ordeal wasn't over yet. The crew still had no idea what had just happened. They didn't know why the engines had failed, nor did they know why they had restarted. They were terrified that at any minute the engines would fail again. So they had one priority: to put some distance between themselves and the sea below. Jakarta Control cleared the flight up to 15,000 feet, and Captain Moody put the aircraft into a climb, but as the plane reached 15,000 feet, the St. Elmo's fire reappeared. The pilots weren't going to take any chances this time once we got back up to 15,000 feet. I did say right, there's something happening here, lads. Let's get out of this. It was fairly obvious that there was something happening outside that was causing our airplane not to behave properly. The captain immediately began descending, but as he descended engine 2, the inner engine on the left-hand side began shaking violently. Number 2 engine began to surge, and I've never heard a violent surge like it. It broke the airplane. It was a big baboom, and it rocked the airplane like mad, such that I felt it might throw itself off the wing. This vibration was so strong that the captain decided to shut down the engine. Now, hanging on by 3 fragile engines, the crew of Flight 9 were going to limp their way back to Jakarta. But 2 nasty surprises lay in wait for them, which would make this next part, while the captain would later describe as the most challenging part of the entire ordeal. It was still pitch black outside as the pilots flew over Jakarta at an altitude of 10,000 feet. Not wanting the fragile engines to fail again, they decided that they would keep the thrust levers exactly where they were until the plane was just moments from touching down. To control his speed, the captain extended the flaps and the speed brakes. He was using aerodynamic drag to counteract the thrust from the engines. But as the crew flew over the city and prepared for their approach, air traffic control gave them some bad news. The glide slope at the airport wasn't working. The glide slope is one of the 2 components of the instrument landing system. The other being the localizer. It gives the crew precise vertical guidance down to the runway. Without it, the pilots' jobs were about to get a lot busier. The first officer would have to quickly couple together a virtual glide slope telling the captain what height he should be at different distances from the runway. Ordinarily, this wouldn't have been too big of a deal, as it was a perfectly clear night and the pilots would be able to see the runway from miles away. But as they lined up with the runway, a second surprise awaited ahead of them were the city lights of Jakarta. But curiously, in the place where the airport normally was, there was just a black space. The pilots have flown into Jakarta many times, and they knew where the runway should be in relation to the city. But for some reason it seemed like nothing was there. The first officer called the tower and asked them to turn the runway lights up, and sure enough, a few seconds later the airport appeared right where they expected it to be, but there was still something odd. It appeared as if the whole city was shrouded in mist. The weather forecast was for it to be perfectly clear outside. What could be causing this? The pilots tried the windscreen wipers, but these had no effect. They then wiped down the windshields themselves in case condensation had formed on them. But still, the view out the window was blurry. They couldn't make out any level of detail, just smudges of light. Then the captain noticed that there was a sliver of clarity running up the left-hand side of his windshield through it. He could see the runway perfectly. This was really strange, but he wasn't going to waste any time figuring out what was causing it. He needed to get on the ground as soon as possible before anything else went wrong with his aircraft. He scooted over in his seat, leaning against the left window post so that he could get a clear view of the runway. It was a delicate operation, with the captain leaning against the window post, making small adjustments to pitch in power, as the first officer guided him in providing altitudes and speeds. Then, passing over the runway threshold, the captain pulled the engines to idle. The first officer counted down the plane's altitude: 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. Touchdown. The captain eased on the brakes and let the nose wheel fall onto the runway. The passengers erupted in applause. They had just survived one of the most horrifying ordeals ever experienced on board a passenger aircraft. The pilots, too, were massively relieved, but they were still flummoxed. What on earth could have caused this bizarre quadruple engine failure when we landed? We got towed in. I went downstairs while we were waiting to be towed in, and I sat on a table in the first class on my pants. And when the tug came, I went back upstairs to sit in my seat. And I looked at my hands, and they were black, and the flight engineer, Barry, said, "I reckon that's volcanic dust." And I said, "Don't be bloody, Darth." Where did that come from? That was the first mention of a volcano, but it was a throwaway line. Then we'd been on the ground a couple of hours, and we were sat in the first class when a French crew based locally came on board, and the captain said, after we'd been talking a bit and we told him what happened, he said, I've flown into a volcano, and he said one's been erupting down the coast or since April. Well, that put the warning bells in our mind ringing, because that should have been no-tamed. So Barry, Roger, the first officer, ran back upstairs, got our paperwork, and devoured everything in it. And he said there's no mention of all of a volcanic eruption in there. So I said, keep that, that's our evidence. And that was the second time, and the third time the next day we went back to the airport to do various things and to look at the airplane in daylight. And I was stood under one of the engines when a chap came up to me and said, "Hello. My name says I'm a Rolls-Royce rep out here doing something with a Garuda." Run a conversation, he said to me. "I reckon you flew into a volcano," he said. "So don't worry, there was an eruption last night and you got caught in it." I said, "Well, let's hope it's something like that, because we don't know what we did anyway." The next morning when I got up, there was an English paper under the door, a local English paper, and the headline was Mount Galangong Downs Jumbo. So it was really 48 hours. Afterwards, I learned this volcanic ash encounter had enormous consequences for the world of aviation. Most importantly, it led to the development of the VAACs, or Volcanic Ash Advisory Centers. There are now 9 of these centers set up covering the entirety of the world's airspace. Their sole purpose is to monitor volcanic activity and send out warnings to aviation authorities when volcanic ash clouds pose a threat to air travel. If you think back to 2010, when a volcano erupted in Iceland, shutting down most of Europe's airspace, you can see how effective these centers have been at preventing similar incidents from happening again. I'll give Captain Moody the last word for a final reflection on this incident. The only thing that I regret is that my first officer and my flight engineer did not get a medal from the Queen. I think that was quite remiss of British Airways management, and to not honor them well. That was quite the story. If you'd like to watch my full interview with Captain Moody, I've put that on the Patreon, and you can join all of these people here watching it now, or if you'd like to binge, watch more videos, there's a perfectly good playlist just up here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.